estimating transactions velocity rather than income velocity. But what we're interested, in other words, I think this would be a case where the theoretical inconsistency would more than outweigh the slight increase in empirical reliability. And then, all right, for our third set of problems, which is that we use output per capita to try to estimate economic well-being, right? If we say, if we compare the United States with output per capita now approaching $60,000 a year, with a country like Sierra Leone, which I think is about 400. I've got the number written down later in the notes. Anyway, that's a huge difference in output per capita. So we can say that Americans on average are a lot richer than people in poor countries like Sierra Leone and Haiti based on these numbers. But these numbers are not, output per capita is not a perfect proxy for well-being or welfare. For a couple of reasons. Or another way of putting it is output doesn't equal utility, doesn't precisely equal utility. One of the reasons is that there is a major form of consumption that is not part of output, which is leisure. To give you a stark hypothetical example, let's say that you have an economy that over the decade doubles output per person. Pardon me. That doesn't double output per person. It doubles productivity. So each hour of labor is producing twice as much over a decade. The people in the economy can take advantage of that increase in productivity at two extremes, or somewhere in between those two extremes. They can work as much, and then output per capita doubles, or they can work half as much, right? And output per capita remains constant. But if you're earning the same amount of money and working half as much, are you any better off? You bet you are. And one of the reasons that European output per capita tends to be lower than the US is because Europeans tend to consume a lot more leisure than Americans. They're not quite as committed to the work ethic.
Especially the Germans.
Yeah, especially the Germans. And in fact, this relates to a phenomenon that Mankiw mentioned in the chapter that you read for today, and a particular case where this didn't happen. It turns out, as Mankiw pointed out, that once a country passes into the threshold of sustained economic growth, which is what we'll be talking about in the next few weeks, so that output per capita over time is in the long run going up, and then the country is defeated in a war. Well, obviously being defeated in a war causes a huge drop in output per capita. But in most cases, what happens is that after the war, rather than having a permanent level effect, the rate of growth accelerates so that you return usually to the previous trend within about 5 years, and the wartime losses seem to have any permanent effect. By the way, this also works with demography. for reasons that I think you can figure out for yourself. But in any case, this is true of Germany after World War I. This is true of Germany after World War II. This is true of Japan after World War II. But there is one case of a section of a country that had gone into a period of sustained economic growth where this did not happen. Where, in fact, it took 20 years before output per capita was back up to its pre-war level. Caitlin, do you remember what?
I don't. I know we talked about it. I don't remember.
Anybody guess? I gave you a hint. It's not a country, it's a section of a country. It's the southern states after the American Civil War. The output per capita in the southern states after the American Civil War. Now, the one thing economic historians know for sure is this cannot be explained by wartime destruction. Sherman's armies going through destroying things on his march to the sea are pretty destructive, but not as destructive as the firebombing of German cities during World War II or dropping atomic weapons on Japan during World War II. So for a while, economic historians puzzled over this problem until they recognized that there was a major change, social change, in the southern states after the Civil War, which was what?
The elimination of slavery.
The elimination of slavery. Well, guess what? Slavery is a system that, when it's successful, is attractive in large part because it can force laborers off their preferred labor-leisure trade-off and make them work longer and harder than they previously worked. So once the slaves were free, right, you no longer had pregnant women working in the cotton fields. You no longer had children beginning to work at the age of 12. The freed slaves began adopting, right, the leisure patterns of free whites, and as a result, the labor input fell by 1/3. The labor input fell by 1/3. Output per capita went down, but were people better off or worse off? Right? Were the slaves better off or worse off? Better off. Right? This is an extreme case where output per capita can fall because people take more leisure and they're actually better off. So that's a big problem. Another problem that applies more strongly to some countries than for others is that output per capita does not adjust for changes in the terms of trade. In other words, the idea of gross domestic product, gross national product, net national product, net domestic product is to measure total output. So consider a country like Kuwait, but let's take an extreme example, where this country produces only one good, oil, exports all the oil, and then imports everything else. The terms of trade are the relative price of oil on the international marketplace. So let's say that the price of oil falls dramatically internationally. The economy is still producing the same amount of oil as before, which means its real GDP per capita is constant, but people are worse off because they can buy fewer foreign goods with it. Now, there is a measure, which I won't hold you responsible for, tries to adjust for this in the national income and product accounts. It's referred to as absorption. Am I spelling that right? I think so. And it's called gross domestic purchases. And what it does is it takes GDP, it adds in the value of imports and subtracts the value of exports. And finally, GDP does not capture changes in scarcity over time. Let me give you some simple examples, and then I'll give you a more extreme example. The Loma Prieta quake in San Francisco, 1989. What do you think that did to GDP in the Bay Area? Do you think it caused GDP to fall? If anything, it might have caused GDP to rise, as money was spent to repair the damage from, in other words, the input was increased to repair the damage from the quake. But that doesn't mean that that the quake didn't have an impact on people's well-being, right? Didn't have a negative impact. Or an agricultural country where there's a huge change in rainfall, and all of this is a reflection of the fact that marginal utility, which is the way we're adding up apples and oranges in these accounts, is not equal to total utility. So think of this as, say this is the demand curve for some good in the economy to the point where it becomes a free good, all right? And this is the current price. And what is GDP measuring? The price times the quantity, marginal utility times the quantity. That value, but what's the total value? You have to put in the consumer surplus. Now, for some reason, the price of the good falls because of a decline in scarcity, right? And the contribution to GDP, in large part, depends on the elasticity of the demand, right? But if because of a fall in scarcity, people are getting more of the good and it's cheaper, right? Total utility's gone up. In the extreme cases, a free good, right? Which provides a lot of utility. Now, the practical relevance of this relates to what happens to GDP during wartime. You can think of wartime as a period in which national security becomes more scarce. So if we draw a production possibility frontier, and on the two axes we put butter per unit time and guns per unit time, and here's our possibility frontier. And during peacetime, the economy is operating at point A, right? and then it gets involved in a major war and it moves to point B, even if output per person remains the same, right? If all of a sudden your productivity, your productive labor, and your capital goods have to be moved from producing consumer goods to producing tanks and bombs and aircraft carriers to destroy other people's stuff, are you better off? You are not better off. You are worse off. Ludwig von Mises captured this aspect in one of his writings when he wrote, "War prosperity is like the prosperity that an earthquake or a plague brings. The earthquake brings good business for construction workers, and cholera improves the business of physicians, pharmacists, and undertakers. But no one has for that reason sought to celebrate earthquakes or cholera as stimulators of the productive forces in the general interest." In other words, war is not good for economic welfare. It's not good for the economy. And logically, that's obvious. But, you know, when some people look at GDP numbers, they think, oh, well, we can improve people's welfare by getting in a war. All right, so these are the problems with the national income and product accounts. Questions? Which, of course, doesn't mean that these numbers are useless, but, right, as sophisticated graduate students, you should be conscious of their weaknesses. Imperfect numbers are better than no numbers at all, but you should be aware of their drawbacks. All right, I have one more thing to cover with respect to the national income and product accounts. And then we'll get to economic growth in the readings for today. Last time when I drew, and this, by the way, is part of the readings, actually part of the chapter from Mankiw that you read for today. Last time when I constructed the circular flow, I did a very simple version. And as Mankiw points out at the beginning of this chapter, it's a little bit more complicated than that. For now, I'm just going to look at the flow of money. So we had money, households paying for consumption goods, firms maybe having transactions between them, but generating income. We can label Y. All right, but the old Keynesian textbooks, this is one of the few things that I like from the old Keynesian textbooks. They used to refer to the complications in the circular flow as leakages and injections. Leakages from this simplistic circular flow and the corresponding injections. And the first leakage, right? People don't spend all of their income on consumption goods. They do what with some of it? How do I spell what? Leakage. The number is that leakage injection. And we're looking at the money. All right, so people not only consume, but they, come on, you read. People not only consume, but your income, do you consume all of your income? Do you spend every single dollar? What do you do with it? Save it. All right, so the leakage is private saving. And the injection is buying capital goods or creating capital goods or paying for capital goods, which is called investment. Now, we need to be clear about some of the terminology because my terminology is different than Mankiw's terminology in the text. In the text, in your readings for today, when Mankiw used the notation S, he was referring to national savings, which is different than private saving. All right? National saving is equal to private saving, either minus the government deficit, right, or plus the government surplus. Those are the same things, right? In other words, he's looking at national savings, and I think it's intuitively more sensible to look at private savings. In other words, when he talks about national savings, since the U.S. government is usually running a deficit, he's subtracting out the government deficit. But how is that government deficit financed? By private savings. All right, so our leakage here is private saving. So S sub P. It goes into the financial system, and eventually firms use it to buy capital goods. So the injection is investment. Now, if we look at gross domestic product in terms of how the money is spent, in other words, aggregate expenditures, we can break it down into C plus I, spent on consumption plus investment. If we look at aggregate income is allocated to consumption or private savings. So if this were the only leakage and injection, savings would have to equal investment. But also, we have this is supposed to be the Capitol building. By the way, I should point out that this private savings is actually private savings net of dissaving. In other words, gross savings is the total amount saved by everyone, but some of the savings goes to other people's consumption. In other words, if I loan Graham $1,000 to go gambling in Las Vegas, right? I've saved, but he's done what's called dissaving, and therefore there's no net savings. So that doesn't add to private savings. Or you should think of private saving as net of dissaving.
Why wouldn't that be lumped in with consumption? Just because you're not personally.
Yeah, it is consumption. It's your consumption. Okay. Right? Which is, in other words, since it's not counted there, it ends up there. So you're absolutely right. All right, so we got government, and people end up paying taxes to the government. So our leakage is taxes net of transfers. In other words, some of your tax money goes to other people. And it just goes, so it's a little bit like this saving, right? Saving that goes to other people's consumption. Some of your taxes are transfers, kicked back to the private sector, and that goes into consumption. So the leakage is taxes, net of transfers, and the injection is not total government spending, because we've subtracted out government transfers, it's government purchases of goods and services. So you need to bear in mind that in the national income and product accounts, when they talk about government spending, they're not talking about the total government spending. They're talking about the government spending net of transfers, which is referred to as government purchases, goods and services. So So here we have that. Now, if we play with the algebra, we can say that in terms of the allocation of the money, in terms of aggregate expenditures, it goes to either consumption, investment, or government purchases. In terms of this side of the equation, it goes to taxes, right? So if taxes net of transfers equals government purchases, then nothing happens. But of course, we have a sort of a bridge between these two, the financial sector and the government sector, right? If